This one is called The Ugly Baby and the Caper of the Swan Swap. This story was written in the olden days. They called it the olden days because they didn't have any new kind of days yet. Not enough time had passed to have a second era of days or anything like that. Yes, everything was still olden back then, which is now, because this story is very old, and these words were written in the olden days, which again, for me, is right now, because I live in the olden days as the writer. Anyway, this story was in the days when everybody lived in a kingdom, and wizards were not yet hunted to extinction, and horses could talk. One day, there were like 7 guys standing around trying to pull a sword out of a stone, and someone came up and said, "Hey guys, there was a really ugly baby that just got born. Get a load of this ugly baby. You gotta see it for yourself." So they all gave up on the sword, and they started murmuring and hurried away excitedly to go see the ugly baby. Now, this was no ordinary ugly baby. It was the firstborn and only born son of the king, whose name was King Weaselman. The animal the weasel had not yet been discovered. It was actually King Weaselman who would discover it 3 years later and give it its titular name. Anyway, King Weaselman's baby was far too ugly to become the next king. Even the peasants were laughing in its face, and the king didn't feel right to have the peasants murdered for it, because he too knew that the baby was too ugly to be kingly. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the kingdom, there was a different kind of baby born. This was no human baby. In fact, it was a swan, a very beautiful swan. All the other swans knew it was the most beautiful swan they had ever seen. Politically speaking, swans had already advanced past humans and had a democracy, so they weren't going to do something stupid like make the swan into a king, but they knew it was good looking. One day, the baby swan went on a field trip with the other swans into the castle. The human peasants would feed them bread, and it was a whole good deal. Anyway, remember the king? Well, the king wasn't too happy about his ugly baby, so he threw it out the window. And luckily, the baby landed on some hay, and he was okay, but now he had to make it out in the world all on his own. Now, don't get me wrong. Obviously, a baby can't talk, but swans can't talk either, so different creatures who can't talk normally can actually talk to each other. Thus it was in the days of old. So the ugly baby saw the beautiful swan on his field trip to get some bread, and the baby was like, "Man, I'm hungry as fuck." And they threw me out the window, and now I'm just out here, just doing my thing in the big city. And the beautiful swan was like, "Yeah, sure, man, here's some bread to eat." And the baby said, "I'm a royal baby. I was supposed to be the king, but I'm too ugly." And the swan said, "Damn, that's crazy. We moved way beyond monarchy like thousands of years ago for swans. Actually, it would be cool to experience it, though." And the baby said, "Damn, we should trade places. Because you're beautiful, so you could be accepted into my family and be king. And me, well, I mean, I'm a baby and I'm dumb as shit right now, but maybe it'll turn out that I'm smart or something and I could be raised in a democracy and I'll thrive someday." "Okay," said the swan. "Okay," said the ugly baby. So they traded places. The ugly baby walked home with all the swans, whose bellies were sated with bread. They were so full they didn't notice the beautiful swan was switched for an ugly baby. Inside the castle, the beautiful swan walked up to the king. They didn't have much protection for the king in those days. Most people were peasants, and peasants were far too stupid to usurp the throne. They'd usually stab themselves in the head before landing a blow. It's an offensive and untrue stereotype that those playing cards have a king stabbing himself in the head, because usually it was the peasants who were dumb enough to do that. Anyway, the beautiful swan said to the king, "I saw your ugly baby, and we decided to switch places. Is it cool if I become the prince and heir apparent to this here throne?" The king looked at the swan and saw indeed that he was as radiant as the sun and as beautiful as a swan. "Okay," said the king. "I mean, it's better than the other option of my stupid baby being the king." Meanwhile, back at Swan Lake, the swans noticed the ugly baby, who explained the whole story using details you already know, and so it's really not worth repeating here. The swans were like, "Damn, that baby is very ugly," so they made him hang out with the ugly duckling. The ugly duckling was so stupid, there was really nothing to talk to him about or do with him. Just really dull and dim-witted. I don't have an example for you, but like you could imagine hanging out with him. It would not be very fun. The baby soon realized that democracy was not going to work out very well for him. He was just kind of stuck in a dead-end situation. Meanwhile, back at the castle, the king made a cool gold chain for the beautiful swan to wear. And in 10 years, that swan became king and was beloved around the whole land. Meanwhile, the ugly baby died from a bird disease, like the bird flu or one of those. Remember at the beginning of this story when I said that they had talking horses back then? What if I told you that I, the author of this story, am a talking horse? I can write too. But I digress. And if you think about the swan and the baby, well, you can see how there's a moral to the whole thing. About how sometimes life is not fair, unless you're a beautiful swan, and then you should press your advantage. The end.